Well, welcome to the book of Psalms. We're into the second part of the biblical literature section. So, if you remember, we've talked about how the Bible is divided into different sections. There's the books of Moses, which is the first five books. There's the history, more chronological history of the people, which is when you get into Judges and Samuels and Kings and Chronicles, those areas. Now we're into the literature aspect of the Old Testament, and that started with the book of Job as a literary work. Even though Job was an actual person, it's written in a way that really extends itself to poetry and literature in teaching concepts and ideas through story. Psalms is one of those books, basically. It's actually one of the largest books in the Bible, is the book of Psalms. There's so many chapters, so much in it, it's really good. So we're going to go through and read these Psalms and help you understand them. So just realize we're off the timeline now of the Bible history. Okay, uh, we left off at the Bible history after the return of the Jews in beginning of the Second Temple period, but now we're going to basically step back and understand some of the literature of the ancient Hebrews through the book of Psalms. So these verses or chapters are poems, Hebrew poetry. It is lyrics to songs that they sang back then as well. So there's some fun things we get to learn through this. Literature and culture is a very important part of understanding the truth or the realities of cultures and different peoples. So every culture has literature that goes with it, has ways of thinking about things. We talked about the difference between the first temple period and the second temple period, the pre-Babylonian exile versus post-Babylonian exile. That the Hebrew language actually went through a transformation. It changed how they phrase certain words, how they write certain things, shifted because the Jews had spent 70 years in Babylon, learned how to kind of mix together some of the Babylonian popular writings with Hebrew writings and changed how they write. So you can tell when you read ancient writings, is this pre-exile or post-exile? So a little marker in there in history we get to look at. So that gives us notice a change in cultures and things that happened. And so Psalms is a part of that. Now, Psalms wasn't just that somebody just didn't sit down and write all this out. It's not one person writing it. The book of Psalms is a compilation of the poems and writings of lots of people. So one of the Psalms, I believe it's Psalms 90, is written by Moses. So that it goes back that far. Quite a few of them, one of the more prolific writers of Psalms was King David. He was a very creative person, had a lot of artistic talent. We hear when you read in Samuel and the other books about David, he sings a lot. He's dancing. He's praising God through song and dance. So he has a lot of wisdom he gives to us through here. His son Solomon wrote some of them as well. And there's many other people who wrote some of these psalms. So we're going to talk about these as we go and have some fun philosophical discussions of the principles that they teach through this poetry. Now realize Hebrew poetry being translated into English sometimes doesn't make sense. We think of poetry as rhyming, but that's not always the case in here. So it feels different. It feels strange to us just because we're used to a poem rhyming. We like to have there's like a cadence to how it's written. There's rhyming words in there that connect. And in the book of Psalms, we don't have a lot of that. So it seems kind of strange, like this is poetry. This is really weird. That's because there's two problems. One, a cultural difference between our day and age and theirs. The second is a translation difference. So in Hebrew, it made a lot of sense. In English, it doesn't come out quite right. So just so you know, that's something you have to think about when you read these, okay? It might not, make sense at face value, but when you think about it, okay, what they would do a lot of times back then is connect the thought. There's a theme, there's a thought or message that goes through this, and they connect thoughts together rather than literally rhyme. They're connecting thoughts. So that's the thing we want to think about is what's the imagery behind this? What is the thought that's behind this? And that can sometimes help us understand the more poetic side of it and some of the other meanings that are in there. So this is going to be a fun time going through the book of Psalms. So I hope you strap in and are ready to have a bit of wisdom every day from the book of Psalms as we get going through this. So let's start with chapter 1 of Psalms. So this is the verse 1 here. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. So this is a really great principle. I'm going to pause right here for a second. Just, this is really nice to think about. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly. So somebody who is following God's counsel, who's going, there's ungodly counsel, there's godly counsel, going in this right direction, or standeth in the way of sinners. How often, this is something that's important for us to look at, how often do we get in other people's way? Just because their path to Christ might seem different than ours. Some people like the scenic route. Some people take the road of hard knocks. Some people like to get there quickly and follow the rules to get there. Some learn the rules by not following them and then come back. There's different ways that we go on this path to Christ. And so it's important that we realize, are we being a hindrance to others? Are we standing in the way of a sinner? Are we between them and God? Are we stopping them? Are we the stumbling block? Are we the issue? That sometimes can happen. And so this is a good opportunity for us to think about that. Where are we maybe hindering the righteousness of others or the repentance of others? It's a good thing to think about. Or sitting in the seat of the scornful, that's judgment, basically. Now, verse 2, but his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night. Do you meditate all the time on the Lord? Do you study your scriptures regularly? If you're watching our videos, one video a day to get through it, that's a good start. That's a good place to be, and then help you to continue to learn. Verse 3, and he shall be like a tree planted by the rivers of water, that bringeth forth his fruit in his season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. What happens when a tree is planted near a river? It gets lots of water. When a tree gets lots of water, it grows tall and strong and mighty and has a lot of a fruit that it can produce. That's great that we think of the waters of life or the words of Christ. He is the living waters. If we plant ourselves by him and use his word to feed us, what can we do? What is the fruit we can produce if Christ is with us? Some good thoughts there. Good thoughts. Verse 4, the ungodly are not so, meaning they're not like this great tree that's producing all this fruit, but are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. Therefore the ungodly shall not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. So in its whole entity of this entire chapter, this is contrasting keeping the commandments of God or not keeping the commandments of God. This is, in the apocryphal writings, this is the way of the two paths, is a common philosophy. We also look at this in our modern days, especially when you get into Isaiah too, of the contrast between Zion and Babylon. The value of having these two choices, or these two options, is now we have choice. We have something to choose and something not to choose. That gives us choice. If we have only something to choose, then we only have one choice. One option isn't a choice. We have more than one option, which means there's choice. So this is really the essence of this chapter, is understanding that we have choice. We can choose wickedness, we can choose righteousness. What it's telling us, of course, is the righteous will prosper and be blessed. The wicked will not. But we shouldn't stand in the way of the wicked either. People have agency. They should be allowed to choose what they want to do. We saw this in lots of scriptures. In fact, if you remember back in Samuel, when the people come to Samuel and go, hey, Samuel, we've decided we want a king. We don't want a prophet anymore to lead us. We want a king. All the cool neighbors and countries around us have kings. We want a king. We know they're wicked. We know they're not following God's plan, but we want a king. We want to be like them. And Samuel's like, no, you shouldn't have a king at all. This isn't good. But he went to God and he prayed about it and says, God, they want a king. And he says, okay, we'll give them a king. And Samuel's like, are you sure? Are you really? We want to give him a king? He says, yes. It is their choice. Being governed by choice is super, super important. God is not going to force his will on us, nor should we force his will on others. We need to realize this. Okay, this is so important for us to think about. Everybody needs their agency. One of the best things you can do for somebody is give them their agency and allow them to make that choice and help them understand the consequence of that choice. I learned this with my children, and if you've had these similar experiences too, or had moments where someone has given you that agency, I'd love to hear it in the comments. I learned with my children as they were growing up, when they're really small and they can't quite make choices themselves very well, as parents, we make the choice for them, and they usually go along with it or throw a fit, but then they get distracted and forget about it and move on anyways. As they get a little older and they start to do more with agency, it's important that we give them their choice. Because I realize that if I make the choice for my children and it goes wrong, they can blame me for their problems. But if they make the choice, there's nobody else to blame. So sometimes my kids would come to me, Dad, can I go to this friend's house or can I go buy this? And I'm like, no, that would not be a good thing for you to do. But I really want to do it. Yeah. They throw a fit and they keep coming back and keep coming back and keep coming back to bug you and bug you and bug you, hoping you will change to their opinion. When that happens, I just look at them and go, okay, I'll tell you what. I'm going to let you make the choice. You can choose what you want to do. But let's talk about the consequence of that choice. If you choose this way, here's what's probably going to happen. If you choose this way, here's what's probably going to happen. Which choice do you want to make? What stood out to me when I did this was when we sat down and talked about it and I made them responsible for their choice, they made the right choice, which oftentimes went against what they initially wanted. Because now they knew if it went bad, they're at fault. They have to own up to that. And they don't want to have to own up to that. They don't want to take responsibility for the problems. So they're going to choose wisely to do what's right because that's the less issues, less problems and challenges, and it ends up working out better for them in the long run. So, but again, if I made the choice for them, they can blame me. Even if I'm right, they can still blame me for taking their choice, for making them do it. If they do it and they choose it, there's nobody to blame but themselves. And I think that's really how one way that God works with us is he gives us choice. Like he did in Samuel for the children of Israel. He says, I'm going to give them a king. I'm going to give them the king that they want. He gave them a king it was Saul, basically the king right before King David. He was a really good king. He was a pretty righteous man. He was a tall, dark and handsome type guy, really good looking, really strong. He could lead. He had some leadership qualities. But when it came to spirituality, the guy was shallow. He wasn't quite as deep in understanding as he could have been. He had, if you read, you realize that Saul ended up with some personality disorders. He had some mental problems, some anxiety, some challenges that he was suffering from. And it caused lots of problems for Israel. Now, the next king they got was a small, scrawny little guy that nobody thought could be king. So physically, he didn't look like a king, but inside, he had the heart of a lion. That was King David. He had the heart of a lion, and he had the Spirit with him. And that was very different, contrast to what Saul was as king. So God basically lets us choose, okay? God did this with Moses. He let the people choose. Moses wanted to bring the people into the presence of God like he had been. And he was trying to get them there, and God wanted that too, but the people weren't willing to do it. And so they had to change things around to accommodate the people. So this first psalm is all about choice and accountability, helping us to realize God prospers those who are righteous. Okay, that does not mean, if you go back into Job, we talk about the gospel of prosperity as a false teaching. It's not if I'm prosperous, I'm blessed of God. It is if I keep the commandments, I am blessed of God, and He prospers me. That doesn't necessarily mean fancy lifestyle. That means He helps you. He takes care of things for you in your life. So, and of course, it says the wicked are going to be as chaff. Now, chaff, if you're not familiar with this goes back to harvesting wheat and plant seeds. When they harvest wheat, there is the wheat kernel, and then the chaff is the hard shell outer protecting of the wheat kernel. So when you get wheat, you have to not just cut the wheat off the stem, but then you have to rub it and grind it up, basically kind of rub it, because it had that chaff, that extra piece has to come off. And as it says in here in verse 4, the chaff which the wind driveth away. This is really fascinating, and I did this with my kids. We when they were growing up, we actually lived next to a field where a farmer had been growing wheat. And one year when he was growing his wheat, he had harvested it, plowed through the field, and there was this little section next to the ditch that he didn't hit. So there was some wheat growing. So we actually stopped and we picked the wheat. We picked it, pulled it off the stems, took it back to our house, and we taught the kids this idea of separating the wheat from the chaff. Now the chaff is just a hull. It's just a outer dry leaf basically around it, around the wheat berry. So there's not much to it. It's light, it's easy, and it's cupped because it sits around that wheat berry basically. So by doing that, when you pull it off, okay, the wheat berry itself has some weight to it. Not a lot, but a little bit. So we actually set up a fan in our backyard, and we had a bucket on the ground, and we had a bucket of all this in the air. And what we would do is just shake the bucket in the air and kind of lightly get it all to spread down, and the berries would drop straight down. The chaff would be pushed off to the side and go just spread out all over the lawn, basically. So this is how we separate the wheat from the chaff. The wheat is the substance. It is the nourishment, it is the food, and it's what goes straight down. The chaff is the excess stuff that just falls off to the side, blows all over the place. Okay, so what they're talking about here is the righteous is the wheat, the nutritious part, the weighty part. The chaff is the false teachings, the unbelief. It moves off with the wind, meaning the wind or other elements control where it goes and what's happening. A philosophy that keeps changing and moving around is kind of like that. The teachings, the core teachings of the gospel are the heavy ones. They don't change, they stay the same. So that's kind of what it's talking about there. So a lot of fun we get to learn just from this one psalm. So let's jump into the next psalm to continue our education.